All right. Hello, everyone. This is, and I'm making sure that this is recording now because I'm recording this for the second time. Okay. But hi, this is your Unit 2 Gilded Age Lesson 2 Industrialization lecture, Part 2. So what that means is in your notes, guys, please pick up where you left off from Part 1 of Industrialization. Don't skip any lines. We're writing in the big right-hand part of your Cornell notes. Now, actually, for this slide right here, you don't need to write anything down. We're just going to review some of the things that we talked about last time about the robber barons slash captains of industry. Because remember, those are the very wealthy industrialists or businessmen during the late 1800s who were kind of running America at this time. The government was taking a back seat, kind of a hands-off approach. And remember what that's called, that's laissez-faire, literally hands-off. The government will not interfere with business. Now, in this political cartoon, we're going to analyze the pieces and figure out what the message is, because a political cartoon is kind of like a puzzle that you have to figure out. It has a point to it. But the first step in figuring it out is to identify the different pieces. So we have here at the top these very, very well-dressed, corpulent or fat men sitting on what looks like bags of money, right? There's dollar signs. And in fact, you can kind of, if you look closely, their bellies are actually made up of money bags. So that could be saying that these guys are very rich, probably indicating, especially from the nature of their clothing and what we've been talking about, their hats, that these are the robber barons or the captains of industry. But considering how they're drawn, to be made to look kind of greedy because they have all this money and they're sitting on what looks like all these poor workers, they would be considered robber barons, right? You have some of the different robber barons photo in this cartoon here. You have Cyrus Field. He was responsible for the first transatlantic cable. That's for connecting telegraph wires from North America across the Atlantic over to Europe. It went from Nova Scotia in Canada over to England. So he was like a telegraph industrialist. Okay. You have Jay Gould, who was famous for his very corrupt investments and railroads. He also worked oftentimes on investments in the railroad with Russell Sage, another robber baron there. And then you have Cornelius Vanderbilt, famous for his early railroad monopoly. So these guys are very significant robber barons, and they have millions of dollars, and they're sitting on cloth, linens, ironworks, lumber, paper, leather goods, which are being propped up by all these workers. These workers are literally holding them up, and you could see that these workers are not getting paid very much at all. $9 a week for these clothing workers, $11 a week for the linen workers, and so on. So again, the message of this cartoon is that these robber barons aren't really working that hard for their money. They're getting all their riches off the backs of these poor workers whom they are taking advantage of. They are robber barons. Um, all right, and that's how you analyze a political cartoon. We're going to be doing a lot of these throughout this class. A philanthropist is somebody who gives back to society. It's kind of like charity. And this is where many of these wealthy businessmen, we would not call them robber barons, we would call them the positive side. And remember, that is being a captain of industry when they're doing good things, like giving back, using their enormous wealth. Probably the most famous of the industrialists who became a philanthropist was Andrew Carnegie in this political cartoon drawn here. Or he kind of looks like Santa Claus, and he's from Scotland, so that explains the kilt and the outfit that he's wearing. Scottish. And he's got this big giant bag of money that it says given for the public good. And actually what it's showing there is that he's building libraries in all these different states. He built libraries across the United States and in other countries of the world because Andrew Carnegie himself had never had much of a formal education. He was born very poor as an immigrant from Scotland. But he was a voracious reader. He loved to read everything he could get his hands on. And so he really credited that with his success in rising up to where he became, one of the richest men in the world, because he was self-taught, because he had access to books. So he wanted to make sure that other poor children also had access to knowledge and education and reading. So remember, Andrew Carnegie kind of looks like Santa Claus with those books. You also had robber barons like John D. Rockefeller, gave back, the Rockefeller Foundation, Vanderbilt University from Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad guy, and many other examples of philanthropy. But remember, philanthropy, you're giving back, kind of like charity. All right, now to form a monopoly, there are two ways. There is the vertical alignment strategy and the horizontal alignment strategy, or I guess you could just be born with it. So I guess there's a third way. Vertical, going vertically, okay, that's where you own every stage of production. Okay, so for instance, like the oil industry, you would own the oil fields where you get the crude oil from the ground. They have those derricks that pump out the oil and stuff. Then you would own the refineries where they purify the oil and make like kerosene. That's what like Rockefeller's early endeavors did. Kerosene was used in the 1800s for most of the lighting around the world. And then eventually you would refine crude oil into gasoline, which we're much more familiar with. Cars, remember, start to become a much bigger thing in like the early 1900s. And then finally, in the vertical alignment strategy, the last step, you own where you get the resource from, you own where you process it, and then the final step is to own the actual distribution device where you would sell it, the retail. And for the oil industry, that's like gas stations. So today that'd be like owning all the Valeros and Exxons and whatnot. You own every stage of production, you've cornered the market. You control that resource, you control it. Controlling every aspect in an industry, that's having a monopoly. Now, the horizontal alignment strategy, that's where you buy out the other businesses. So you're going across. That's horizontal. It's flat, it's cross. You buy out the other businesses. So again, with like the oil example, that would be like, let's say Valero. Some of you like Stripes, right? We'll say Stripes. That would be like Stripes buying out Valero and Chevron and Texaco and Exxon and buying out all these other gas stations until the only gas station left that you could go to is Stripes. Now, that's the horizontal method. Now remember, all of this is to form a monopoly. Okay, once you own all of the industry, you own all the gas stations, or like the fast food industry, McDonald's buys out all the others. Once you are the only one left, what can you do? You can raise the price to whatever you want it to be. Okay, and then you can be filthy rich, and people don't have any choice. They have to get their product from you because you're the only one selling it. So that's what a monopoly does. That's why businesses like to form them, because it makes them very wealthy. Now, the disadvantages of monopoly, of course, are that we as consumers, the people who buy these things, we don't have choices anymore. We also have to pay a lot more money. Also, workers get taken advantage of. So there are some really bad aspects to monopolization. And during this time in the Gilded Age, lots of companies were forming these massive monopolies. Like John D. Rockefeller, his oil company was called Standard Oil. That was the oil company in America. He would ruthlessly buy out the competition, kind of by underselling. He would charge just slightly less than what his competitors were charging for oil. And then once they went out of business, he'd buy them up, and then he would raise up the price. So this is about forming monopolies. The working conditions in factories were terrible during this time. There were no safety standards in place. There were no regulations or rules from the government, because remember, the government is what? Laissez-faire. It's hands off, right? It's hands off. And that meant there's no standardized workday. So workers could be working 10, 12, 16 hours a day. Some even worked more. You like having your weekends off? Because I know probably some of you are starting to get jobs, or maybe you already have a job as, a 16, 17-year-old high school student. You know, typically you'd have a day or two off during the week. There was no guarantee of that for these factory workers, and there's no minimum wage. Now, granted, there's inflation, so you know the price of everything back in the late 1800s is much, much cheaper than it is today. But they were making, you know, less than $5 a week. Okay, that would be like making. You could do a conversion chart here. In fact, let's see what that looks like. What was $5 worth in 1890? I love the internet. Let's just get a rough estimate. So yeah, they would be making far less than $200 a week. Okay. That is not enough money to live on. It's crazy. And this is what was going on. Not to mention, you know, they're having these long hours. They're getting paid next to nothing, and the conditions in these factories were incredibly unsafe. You know, workers at the big steel mills, they're working with those big furnaces for like the Bessemer process, where they're superheating molten iron ore to like, you know, basically lava, you know, thousands of degrees. Yeah, like sparks and other things, you know, and pieces of the molten iron ore would go flying, and it could land on your skin and sizzle, and you could get like third-degree burns, and you're never going to get that skin back. It's permanently burnt off, or you get blinded. Or some of the big machinery, you know, you don't get your hand out of the way in time. Lots of people lost arms or legs. Many people died. There were thousands and thousands of deaths in factories during this time period, the Gilded Age, that nobody, you know, was really doing anything about. Workers were cheap and replaceable. They were seen as machines. If you've ever watched, or maybe you've read the famous book or the movie, The Wizard of Oz, remember the Tin Man. He was the one Dorothy met that he just wanted to have a heart. He represents the factory workers in the Gilded Age, that basically they were treated like machinery, like tin men. That if one got broken, you just replace them with another, because they would work for next to nothing. Because many of them were immigrants, and they came to America because we had jobs available in these factories, and that was better than what they were leaving behind. But it was not very good jobs. These were not very good jobs. So what eventually is going to happen to fix these problems is that workers will unite. They will come together. See, like that fist in that political cartoon, that means power, power to the people, in this case, power to the workers, that they're going to come together to try to improve their situation. And when workers do that, that's called a labor union. You know, labor for workers, union, you come together. The two of the earliest labor unions in the United States were the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. Both formed kind of in the decade or two after the Civil War. The Knights of Labor became really, really big by the latter part of the 1880s. They had close to 1 million members. But after the 1886 Haymarket riots, they kind of fall apart. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL it's called, is going to steadily grow. They're a lot more conservative, and eventually by the 1950s, they will join with the CIO to become the AFL-CIO, today one of the largest labor unions in the world. So these unions, they're fighting for an 8-hour workday, okay? They want workers to have to work no more than 8 hours. What else are they fighting for? Better pay, right? Eventually, we will get a minimum wage. That's not going to be for a while, though. You know, we're talking about the 1880s, 1890s, and in our units on the Gilded Age. It won't be until the 1930s that you start to get the first minimum wage. That's during the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. They're also fighting for better workplace safety and standards. We don't actually get that going until like OSHA in the, I think, the 1970s. So these are the things that these unions, these workers or labor unions are fighting for. The biggest thing was the 8-hour workday. The difference between these two big early unions, though, is that one, the Knights of Labor, was much more accepting of different groups of people into their membership. The Knights of Labor eventually included women, because by 1900, about a quarter of the workforce or more was made up of poor women, immigrant women, poor women. They worked all kinds of seamstresses jobs, sewing and other stuff in factories, or there was a growing number of women also starting to work secretarial work. But there were very few union options for them. The Knights of Labor would allow women. They also eventually allowed African Americans as well, although they did force them to be in segregated union groups. The other thing that the Knights of Labor did that was very inclusive, like, accepting, allowing these different groups in, was they also allowed in unskilled workers. A skilled worker, you know how to do a certain job. You have a skill set, like some of you maybe know how to fix a car. Okay, that's a skill set. You are a skilled worker. If you just have the job to like tighten this one rivet all day long, that's not really a skill. You could just do menial tasks. You're unskilled. The Knights of Labor would accept skilled and unskilled workers. Now, the AFL, to contrast, they only accepted skilled workers. They put them in trade unions, craft unions. They also did not accept women. They did not accept African Americans or minorities. So that's the differences there between the Knights of Labor and the AFL. The leaders, the Knights of Labor, their main leader, you should maybe remember, is Terence Pemberley. And for the AFL, their main leader was Samuel Gompers. And I know it's dumb, but I have a way of remembering Samuel Gompers. I think of Pac-Man. You ever play Pac-Man? Chomp, 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 chomp. I think of him like gomping up stuff. Okay, so chompers, and that rhymes with Gompers, and that's how I remember Samuel Gompers. If that helps you, there you go, Samuel Gompers. The AFL will be more successful than the Knights of Labor. It will last. It is still around today because they were more careful and because they did not include all these different groups. The Knights of Labor will be branded as radical and violent after several incidents, namely the Haymarket Square riots, or the Haymarket Affair, it's sometimes called. So the last thing in our notes today, some of these important moments of violence in the early fight for labor unions. Now, if you're a labor union and you're fighting to improve your workers' condition, to give them better pay, shorter hours, a safer working environment, one of the tactics you can use is to strike. And a strike is where the workers refuse to go to work. That, of course, hurts the business because they're not getting the workers making the stuff. They're not able to sell it. That hurts their bottom line. They won't be making money. Businesses like to make that money, right? They could also do picket lines. They could also petition. They could also have collective bargaining, although that will not be a governmentally protected right until the Wagner Act, again in the 1930s. But the strike was the main tool at the disposal of these labor unions. The workers would refuse to work. And you could see how important it is that they're in a union, that all these workers are doing this together. Because if just like 3 workers striked, and then you have like 107 over here who are still working, well, what's the business owner, the factory owner going to do with those 3 workers who are striking? They're going to get the pink slip. They're going to get fired. So it's important that all these workers are united. They're in the union. They all agree to do the strike. At a picket line, that's where they refuse to let anybody go to work. Now, if you tried to get in and work in the factory because you really needed to put some bread on the table and you were out of money that week and you desperately needed to work and the union was having a strike, you were known as a scab. Okay, that was a bad thing because you were messing up the strike. You were messing up the effort that all these workers were doing to try to get their boss to make things better. So anyway, that's what's going on. Now, the first big strike that ends up very violent we're going to talk about is the Pullman strike. It was near Chicago at the Pullman factory. Pullman factory made those fancy sleeper cars, like a railroad car. It has the coach class. It has the normal chairs on a railroad that people sit in. But there's also railroad cars that have these compartments that have these beds that fold down and people can go into the compartment, have some privacy and lay down, and when they wake up they're at the next place. That's called a sleeper car, and that's what the Pullman factory built. And the workers at the Pullman factory, like in many factories, they were required to live in the company town that was located right next to the factory. And they were required to buy their groceries at the company grocery store and do all of their business at the stuff that was owned by Mr. Pullman, the wealthy businessman, industrialist, the robber baron there. Well, obviously the workers did not like this situation because he had jacked up the prices on everything in all of the company-owned stores. The rent for their tiny, crowded little tenement apartments was outrageous. The price of the groceries at the Pullman grocery store was ridiculous. And not to mention that they couldn't afford these things from the salary that they were getting working at the Pullman factory. So how were they supposed to do this? They were being taken advantage of every which way. And so they started a massive railroad strike, refused to work there. And eventually the Illinois National Guard was called in, like armed soldiers, to break it up. Eugene Debs was a famous leader of this strike. Later, he will run for president as a socialist candidate in 1912 and actually gets 6% of the American electorate's vote. All right, the next strike, the Homestead strike. Homestead Steel was one of the main plants for Carnegie Steel. Remember, this is Andrew Carnegie. He's the steel robber baron, the steel captain of industry. That's his industry, steel. And at Homestead Steel in near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, they had a craft union. So the workers were skilled tradesmen with making, iron ore into steel with the Bessemer process and whatnot. And they had an agreement that the company foreman, the manager there, Henry Frisk, who worked for Mr. Carnegie, would not hire any unskilled workers because they would work for less. And then the skilled workers in the union, they would be making less money. So they said, you can't hire any of those unskilled workers, keep them out. Well, the company did just that. It broke its word, started to hire some of these unskilled workers. So what the trade union did was it striked. And they actually surrounded the factory, the workers doing this strike, and refused to let anybody in. And so finally, Mr. Frisk, he couldn't get a hold of Carnegie, supposedly, because Andrew Carnegie was away golfing conveniently, right, during this time over in Scotland, where he's from. So he wasn't there. So Mr. Henry Frisk makes the decision to call in a private security task force to get the workers removed. And this was called the Pinkertons. Pinkertons are kind of famously seen as like America's first Secret Service. They guarded Abraham Lincoln. They were security basically for hire. Okay. And 300 of them were hired. There's a battle, like a pitched battle that ensues with shots being fired between these steel workers and these Pinkerton agents. And several on both sides were killed. And eventually the Pinkertons, they're outnumbered by thousands of steel workers. They're forced to retreat. And then the governor of Pennsylvania has to again call in like the guard, soldiers, and finally break it up. And there were many that were killed, hundreds that were wounded, and that was the Homestead Steel Strike, probably one of the most deadly labor strikes in American history. I believe that one took place in 1892 or 94. In 1886, you have the most infamous of the labor violence, and that was in Chicago, Illinois, at the Haymarket Square. Now, the actual events came about from the previous day at the McCormick reaper factory. It's where they make these reapers that like cut down the stalks when you're harvesting crops and stuff. There had been a clash between workers striking and the police had killed several of the workers that had been striking at the McCormick plant. And so the following day, labor leaders and the city government agreed to do like a peaceful march. Does this sound familiar, right? In protest of police brutality through downtown Chicago. And in Haymarket Square, they were giving speeches and everything was progressing very peacefully. And then the cops came and started to disperse the crowd, and nobody knows exactly who did it, but somebody threw a bomb at the police. Maybe a Molotov cocktail, a homemade bomb, and it goes off, and there are about 7 policemen that are eventually killed. Some of them maybe even by friendly fire as the police started firing randomly into the crowd. It's incredibly chaotic and dangerous. There were several bystanders that were hit. And when the dust settles, 8 leaders from the Knights of Labor were arrested and charged with this violence and death, even though there was no evidence linking them to that bomb or any of the carnage that had ensued. They get the death penalty. 4 of them actually are hung. Again, no evidence. It's just, hey, you were striking and protesting, so you're going to die. And then 1 of them committed suicide before his hanging, and 3 others eventually get their sentences commuted to life in prison. But the point of this, the Haymarket affair, is that it branded labor as violence. It made people scared of labor unions. Now, were the labor unions themselves violent? No. Their purpose was to try to improve the lives of workers who were living in a terrible, terrible situation. Their purpose, the purpose of a labor union, was to get an 8-hour workday. That's what the Knights of Labor were protesting. Their purpose was to make sure that workers were getting paid fairly for their time and that they weren't working in a situation that was likely to get them killed. But because of the Haymarket affair and these other incidences, they were branded as too violent, too radical, and that's eventually why the Knights of Labor fell apart. The AFL kind of stayed out of that. All right, so that is all we're going to talk about right now on industrialization. Thank you guys so much for paying attention. Remember, in your notes, that's the end of lesson 2. So go to that summary, take a quick look at your essential question, look at what it's asking. If you need a reminder, maybe you should have written this down at the top of your paper. What were some of the positive and negative consequences of industrialization? We're talking about factories. What were the good things about this? The captains of industry, they made America. What were some of the bad things about this? We talked about the bad aspects. Okay, mainly what was going on with these guys. Talk about that. Talk about what they had to do. Talk about what happened. Okay. All right. Once you finish your summary, you are done with lesson 2 of the Gilded Age. I will talk to you guys later. Thank y'all very much. Bye.